Hi, welcome to Jus Cogens, the International Law Podcast. Today we have a very interesting episode. We have changed the format a little bit. We have 9 people from all over the world, and we are going to talk about the experiences, the challenges, and opportunities of young professionals pursuing or trying to pursue a career in international law. As you can see, there's a lot of us in this podcast, and we have tried to make it as diverse as possible so that we have interesting and have unique perspectives from all over the world. So just to get the discussion going, I'd like to start with Yusra. If you can just tell us a bit about your background and why you chose to pursue a career in international law and what you're doing currently.
Well, thanks very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you today and engage in this really interesting discussion. So I'm currently based in Geneva, Switzerland, where I am completing my PhD in public international law at the University of Geneva. Prior to reaching the end stages of the PhD, I was in The Hague for a little bit working at the International Court of Justice, and I've also worked at the International Labour Organization Administrative Tribunal. And I chose to study international law simply because it's really the only thing that resonated with me and my values and interests when I started law school.
All right, great. Can we have a few more? Maybe Mohit, can you tell us a bit about why international law as a career is something that you decided to pursue, or that's something that you think would be a viable career for you?
Thank you very much, Omer, for having me today, and I'm very honored to be here. To tell you a bit about myself, it's been exactly 5 years that I have been trying to tread on the tricky path of public international law, but my motivation behind this area of law was the very fascination of how anything and everything that comes under the sun falls within the purview of this. And which is why ever since I entered law school, I think I saw Ian Brownlee in my library, and the interest just catapulted from there, to be extremely honest. And coming to your second prong of the question, which is that why is this a viable option? I think whether it's viable or not is something which is, I guess, a premature assumption to make, but it is what has been a passion. And particularly coming from India, I do believe that the pitch that India has at the United Nations right now, where I've had some kind of experience in the pursuit of trying to find a permanent seat at the United Nations Security Council, I think that many people like me have to develop interest in this. And I think it's time for having some equilibrium of South Asia in this niche field of law.
Right, perfect. So there's general an assumption by people that there are not a lot of opportunities in international law, and there are these prestigious organizations such as the ICC, the ICJ, and other international criminal tribunals, and they offer internships. Most of them are usually unpaid, and a lot of students who, after doing their LLMs, they get one of these internships, and then they finish these internships, and then they apply for another internship, and then they finish another internship, and they still are unable to get a job in those organizations or related organizations. Has anybody of you, experienced similar problems while trying to forge a career as an academic or as a practitioner or as an advisor? Maybe I'll go to Aisha. If you can tell us a bit about your experience.
Thank you very much for having me tonight. I'm Ayşe from Istanbul, Turkey, and I'm newly graduated from Sorbonne Law School, LLM in International Law. So my dream was to work in international law, but Turkish practice in international law has to be more developed, although we have very old diplomacy traditions. Our practice is limited with just now for European Court of Human Rights. And so as a lawyer, I admit that I have no many opportunities in my country in litigation. My possible roadmap is to pursue a PhD degree and move on with academia. but I would really gain experience in litigation. And we found an international law association, Jus Cogens, in 2016, and our dream is to turn it into an academy. And association gave me different perspectives on very different topics like rule of law, gender, transitional justice, and a huge impact on my career path. However, I would be really happy if I can carry all this together one day: academia, litigation, and how to say, association.
Taylor, I'd like to come to you. So how has your experience been after, doing an LLM in international law and trying to find, some suitable opportunities in the field?
First of all, thank you, Omer and Shayan, for having me on the podcast. I'm really thrilled to be taking part in this conversation with everyone. So I have a background in law and international studies from Melbourne, Australia, which is where I'm from. And in 2018, I moved to The Hague, the Netherlands, to pursue the Master of Public International Law at Leiden University. While I was at Leiden, I secured a position as a research assistant at Human Rights in Practice, a strategic human rights litigation practice. And once I graduated, I got an internship at the Astor Institute, an international law research institute based in The Hague. In that position, I conducted legal research on my main fields of interest being international human rights law, international humanitarian law, and international criminal law. I finished my internship in January of this year, and I was lucky enough to be offered a temporary contract at the Institute, which I know is not always the case, but in my experience, particularly where I've been working, it has been the case that people and interns have been given the opportunity to stay on for a temporary contract afterwards. So I feel really lucky in that respect. And I think also one of the really beneficial things about doing this internship for me was building my network and meeting people who work in the field and really inspired me. So that's kind of been my experience so far.
So my question is directed towards Raghavi and Tola, in fact, both of you, Raghavi, sorry. If you compare your situation before you did your LLM and after you did your LLM, so how has the transition been like, and has it really thrusted your career in a way you sort of expected it to? We'll start with Raghavi and then we'll move on to Tola.
Thank you so much for having me. So my name is Raghavi. I'm a lawyer trained in India. I did my bachelor's degree in an integrated bachelor's degree in arts and law from India. And then I went on to pursue my first master's at the University of Oxford. And now I'm doing an advanced LLM at Leiden in public international law, but I intend to specialize in international criminal law. Now, I think for me, in the penultimate year of my bachelor degree, I became interested in international criminal law. And I knew that I wanted to focus on this niche area, but I did not really have the opportunities to find more advanced training for this in India, particularly because India is not so centrally involved in the policy making and the litigation in this field. So I knew that if I needed more advanced training, I would have to pursue a higher education degree abroad. And for me, Oxford was really the most ideal platform for me to not only receive training and exposure to top academics in the field, but also gave me a real push in terms of access to opportunities. At the end of my course at Oxford, where I also studied international criminal law as one of my modules, I got a fellowship from Judge Meron, who was actually teaching us that year, which was really a fantastic experience. He awarded a fellowship where I got the money to pursue a 3-4 month internship at the IRMCT. And I feel like through the fellowship, through interacting with him, I also had a clearer idea of wanting to enter academia in the field. And I knew that I wanted some time after the internship to mull over it, to receive more advanced training and to find out really what I want to specialize in. So there has been a very material and conspicuous difference, I'd say, in my life and in my understanding of what I expect from the field post my LLM degree.
All right, thank you very much. My name is Adetola Onayemi. I'm a Nigerian. I have my first degree in law and my master's degree from the University of Cambridge in the United Kingdom. I'm currently the Assistant Chief Negotiator for the entire Nigerian government. And I was instrumental for negotiating the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which is probably the biggest agreement in trade after the WTO agreement of 1994. And I was lead negotiator for Nigeria in that regard. So focusing on your question about my LLM. So for some context, when I finished my undergrad, I did not specifically think I was going to go do a specialization in international law. Actually, when I went for my master's, what happened was that I thought I was going to be an international commercial lawyer, transactions and all that kind of stuff. And then what happened was when I started classes, I thought, you know what, the best transactional lawyers I know do not particularly have a master's degree. So maybe it's a waste of time to spend my time trying to do a master's degree in commercial law area. So I thought, you know what, I'm just going to attend every class. And whichever class I think I enjoy the most is the one I'm going to actually try and do a module in. So it was supposed to be an experimentation. So I attended all the classes, and then I ended up doing more modules in international law, and particularly the international economic law areas, so international IP, international public international law, and all that. And the popular George Crawford of the ICJ actually taught me. And so what happened was I then wrote a thesis on cross-retaliation under the WTO rules, helping Antigua and Barbuda operationalize the judgment they had gotten from the WTO tribunal. And that basically launched my career, because what happened was that shortly after that, I started speaking in a number of panels and advising a number of governments on how to structure that. Shortly after that, I got a role, more like an role at the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, thanks to this, my master's degree. And then I got poached by the Nigerian government to come serve as a special advisor on industry, trade, and investment to the president, and then set up the standalone trade office for the country and lead as trade negotiator for the country. And due to that, the AFCFTA became a priority, and then we marshaled out the agreement for the AFCFTA. So when I traced the entire record, definitely my LLM was where that journey started. Of course, I'd done international and another career, but the definitive moment of knowing that I wanted to start a career and also picking up the tools and even the credentials. Because what happens was I could then have a conversation and say, oh, I know international law, but I have a degree in it, and I've written this research and this thesis in it, and so I could speak on those issues. So yes, it was a very trajectory-changing moment for me to have my LLM in international law.
So moving this along, Alexander, so in choosing Leiden, what did you specifically look for? So at the time that you were applying, what specific factors were you looking in school for you to say, okay, this is the best fit for me?
So first of all, hi everyone. My name is Alexandre Nicolae. I'm French, and yeah, I did my first LLM in public international law in Leiden last year, and I'm currently a student for a second master's program in Paris at Université Paris 2 Panthéon-Assas, with a focus on international criminal law. And well, maybe I will be able to, on this podcast, be able to present the French perspective on public international law, at least the French bubble, because it is very much a bubble in the sense that I did not know a lot outside of this bubble while I was in my bachelor. And I wanted to go to Leiden specifically to discover, well, what's outside of it. And also, I took a look at the rankings online, and every one of them said that Leiden had the #1 in the world PIL program. And so, because I had fallen in love with the subject, of course I wanted to go there. And I applied. I didn't expect to get in, but I did. And then I went there, and I was very happy with what I found there. The network I've made, the contacts I've made there have been really useful. I am currently an intern as well in The Hague within the Kosovo Specialist Chambers, and I think that would not have been possible without my Leiden degree, because it has streamlined a lot of my my work so far. Have I answered your question?
Yeah, in fact, you have. So taking on from the French bubble that you speak of, so we know that both English and French are the operative languages of the UN. So this is a question for you, Yusra, and whoever else knows French. How has knowing more languages or knowing the official languages of the UN impacted or progressed your career in the field of public international law?
So I am a bilingual English-French speaker, and in my personal experience, I feel like in almost every professional opportunity I've had, my bilingualism has been a huge factor that has interested potential employers. And that even is applicable to my teaching job currently at the university, because I teach my course in both English and French. And that's what was being searched for at the time. So generally, not French in particular, but I would just say all languages are really beneficial. But there are some specific domains of work or institutions where French is particularly valued. And an example would be the International Court of Justice, wherein they do value, for example, I participated in the Judicial Fellowship Program as a trainee, and there you do have to have at least a minimum level of French, at least in theory, to apply for the program. So I definitely can't emphasize that enough to just work on any languages. I think that could be a great plus to anyone's CV.
There's this more topical issue that I would like to talk about. That's something which Adetola and even Raghavi mentioned earlier, that there's this perception that international law today is mostly based in a few centers around the world, in Europe and perhaps in the US, and in a lot of institutions are primarily based in close proximity in a few areas of the world. So in terms of specialization, whether it's your LLM or your PhD, what are the factors that influence you to choose a particular specialization, and how do you choose these particular institutions that you have talked about? What are those aspects that are the most dominant in your decision making? So maybe Mohit, since you talked about this thing earlier, maybe you can take it from here.
Thanks, Omer. Just before I address this, I had one very interesting observation as a follow-up to what Yusra said actually about French as a language. I'm happy to share with all of you that in this September, actually, I am going to go to the International Court of Justice as a judicial fellow. And I had been applying for this position for the past 3 years from Stanford University. And each year I asked myself as to what is the reason as to why I'm not getting this position. And my answer lied in the fact that in my first 2 years, I didn't have enough French proficiency. So I think that says a lot about the question that you had asked.
Yeah.
And now coming to the other question, which is about the thought process behind choosing an LLM. So I'm going to share my personal journey here. I pursued my LLM in International and Environmental Law from Stanford University. And at the time when I was applying, I already had certain chalked out subject matters which were of interest to me, which were public international law, environmental law, human rights, and investment arbitration. Now, I told myself that the synthesis of these 4 interests is having a common ground which has got to do with factors which are very important in the current scenario, such as climate change, biodiversity, health. I mean, I needn't say more with the outbreak of COVID-19 as to how important such issues are. So this was the thought process behind the subject matters. Now, there is a very cliched yet important debate about university reputation versus course reputation whenever we're choosing our masters. Now, everybody wants the best of both the worlds ideally, and I consider myself extremely fortunate to having found both in my pursuit, because I don't know how well this is known, but Stanford, amongst the top schools as we speak about, holds the unique distinction of having 4 very niche crafted sub-specializations. So essentially when we receive our degrees, we have that specialization on our diploma. So given that, the environmental law and policy specialization also happened to be one of the best in the world, alongside Stanford's reputation. And undoubtedly, the position that I had led me to one thing after the other, and it was essentially a foot in the door. I did have to do many unpaid internships after that, but those, as everybody has been sharing, transitioned into paid consultancy, and finally as to what I just shared with all of you. Thanks.
Right, great. Can we have one more opinion on this? Perhaps Taylor?
So I think that indeed, as already has been mentioned, there probably are certain bubbles of international law that kind of are based in different cities. When we think of The Hague, we think of international criminal justice with the ICC and numerous tribunals. When we think of Geneva, we think of the work that the ICRC does and international humanitarian law. So I think if you already know when you're moving into your master's that you really have your heart set on one particular strain, one particular area of international law, then maybe this is a good way for you to narrow it down. But that being said, for me, when I started, I didn't really know what I was interested in. And I was really happy with the program at Leiden because it really touched on a whole host of different areas. And I knew that I had inadvertently come into the International City of Peace and Justice in The Hague, and that there would be a lot of opportunities in terms of internships in international criminal justice institutions here. But I think there are still opportunities for you to pursue your interests, not being just confined to those bubbles. So I think even if you find yourself in a place where everyone is talking about ICL, don't let that stop you from talking about climate change or international humanitarian law or outer space law. I think if you already have a really clear idea, then go for it. But I didn't feel limited by that.
Right. Raghavi, you'd like to add something?
Yeah, so sorry about that.
No, that's okay.
So just on the point of PhDs, I feel like the considerations are slightly different, at least they were for me. And I do think that a couple of different factors usually play in your mind. In this point, I wanted to say 2 things. Firstly, on the question of how do you decide what you want to specialize in, I think that's completely interest. Through your research experiences, through your moot court experiences, your papers, once you know you want to do a PhD, the topic will really appear to you. So I don't think you need to chase it, it will come to you. That's number 1. But second, on where to do the PhD, at least when I was doing this search personally, I found that there's a real dearth of information on what to look for in a PhD program and where to do your PhDs. And there are actually lots of considerations that are not publicly known. For instance, in the UK, all PhD courses are paid courses, which is not the design in Europe. So the Anglo-Saxon design is very different from the design in the Europe. Similarly, the process of looking for funding is also far more stringent in the UK than it is for European programs. In most European universities, if you get admitted to a PhD, you are also admitted to a scholarship at the same time. Also, I think a big consideration for the PhD is accessibility. So your ease of access to courts, tribunals, or basically sites where your research is located, that's also a big consideration. So I think that not just what is otherwise known, which is concentration of faculty or the reputation of the university, I think there are other aspects like funding, the ties that the university has with governments, or even how easy it is to access your resources that really play in your mind when you
Right.
complete to do a PhD.
Oh, great. Aisha, would you like to add something?
Yes, I would like to add something to what Taylor said a couple minutes ago. At that time, I applied for 5 LLM programs, Sorbonne, Queen Mary, Strasbourg, Geneva, and Leiden. And I got negative answer from Leiden without any reasonable explanation. I really thought at that period results were political because Turkey had a diplomatic crisis with Netherlands. Then I started my master's degree in Sorbonne Panthéon, and the French system is really hard, and I had many difficulties to adapt myself into a new methodology. However, I was very interested with human rights, humanitarian law, etc., and my paper was on enforced disappearances in Bosnia. But the jury was the worst experience in my life, and thankfully I'm graduated. So I would like to say subjects are not limited. So knowing ourselves is a long life experience. So that's what I want to add to Taylor's speech.
Right. There's something interesting that I just observed that based on Mohit's experience, and congratulations for securing the judicial fellowship. I hope you're able to join during these very uncertain and difficult times, is that there are two schools of thoughts. One is that being in close proximity to these international institutions and proximity makes it more likely for someone perhaps from the global south or even otherwise to choose an LLM program or a PhD program in the UK or in Europe, while Mohit had a different experience. He went to the US and he was still able to achieve the same goals which perhaps a student would have aspired for going to Europe or the UK. So Tola and Alexander, perhaps incorporate these elements in your points as well. I see that you'd like to contribute something. Perhaps Tola, you can go first, and then Alexander, you.
Yeah, so I have a range of thoughts to put on this topic. I think the first thing I'd like to say is that I find that because international law is a very small community, it's a very relationship-based community, and I think it's important to identify that and say that over and over again. It's a very relationship-based community. People don't highlight as much the places of conferences and those kind of places where you informally make relationships with experts in the field. Because the thing is, the word just goes around. People know what opportunities are available. People know what's going to happen. A number of times. And I probably learned this pretty early because I had a mentor figure and in the international law space. But the truth is, to a great extent, they generally know who's going to get the opportunities. It's just the nature of it, right? So one of the things I would say is that one of the advantages that universities that are based in most of those concentric circles have, probably Geneva or The Hague, is that professionals in that field will focus on that universities because they're probably working there, they're living there, and so of course they want to teach there. But the truth regardless is that there's still, to a great extent, a diverse pool that those institutions still try to attract. And what happens a number of times, and I've seen this happen a number of times, that people go to conferences, make a good presentation at a conference, build a relationship with someone who's an expert at those conferences, and then next thing you know, you want to send an application in, and then you can actually reach out to those people and say, oh, I'm sending my application to this organization, what do you think? And they'll be like, oh, I'll put in a word for you, and generally that. And I think it's important to say the place of relationships, because the opportunities are also very limited, and there's also a financial implication. So what I mean by that is this: if you get an internship in the UN system in Geneva or The Hague, okay, well, let me keep Geneva out of it, but The Hague, you're not going to get paid. And that is a very serious consideration for a lot of people, because you're going to have to approach yourself from the US or from Nigeria and then move to a place like that. Another thing to also say in making considerations more general around schooling is, I find that, and it's probably my experience, that I find that it's best to focus on also the faculty, so the lecturers in that school, what's the experience that students in that school have had with building relationship with faculty. And the reason that's important is that I found that to a great extent, because these people already have some credibility, they can lend you those credibility in giving advice. So for instance, Enin Crossroads Khan in Cambridge lent me a lot of credibility in most of my career after University of Cambridge, right? So there's also that you're looking out for. You're looking for what's this lecturer, what's that? And I find, for instance, that my experience is either you go for very experienced lecturers who are older or mid-level professionals. They're generally a lot more ready to help young career professionals just starting their careers, either because they've already reached the climax of their careers or because they're also at the mid-level of it, and so they're ready to give you a leg up. The two other things I'll flag is that in picking considerations, I know it's very fancy to want to pick a school that has a very great name and has a great pedigree. But one thing I would say also is that I think always look for opportunities that allows you have a taste of the variety of what international law offers. People think they want to do international economic law till they find out that there's something called human rights law. People think they want to do labor law till they find out there's something called space law. So I find that it's always better to go from the general to the particular. So start from a more generalistic idea, and then you can, after experiencing a range of it, you can then say, oh, I want to narrow down on this. The last thing I would say on this, more generally also, is that my experience and having to mentor young or other young professionals coming up in their career, my experience has also been that when you are trying to shoot for this, I think also focus on, decide quickly what you want to do with your international law degree. So do you want to litigate? Do you want to be an advisor or a consultant? Do you want to be an academic? Do you just want, and because the different universities have different kind of opportunities that come with them. So for instance, if you went to the US, for instance, you'll probably get a lot more academic options than if you were in a place like The Hague, or if you went to sort of like the Geneva, you probably have a lot more opportunities of meeting top professionals in the international economic law field. So I think those considerations are also important. What do you want to do with it? Do you want to practice? Do you want to litigate? Do you want to be an academic? Those are considerations you also want to look at when making these decisions.
Tola touched on some of the points I wanted to mention, so I'm not going to repeat what he just said, and I'm just going to maybe add some of the perspective from within that French bubble, which I mentioned earlier. I don't know if people are aware of that, but in France, you're not actually allowed to do internships if you are not linked to a university. So if you're not actually following up on a degree, you're not allowed to be working for an institution in France, institution or company or whatever. This is because they really want to make sure that the employer, the company or the institution is following French labor law. So they make you sign a contract and everything. It's a real hassle, but it's in the interest of the students and the university. And so this means that in the French view, internships are always linked with your studies. And that means that once you're done with your degree, French students typically are not going to straight away jump into internships. What they typically will do, and this is also what I will do, I admit, is attempt to pass the bar. And only then, once they pass the bar, which is a big exam with about 25% of those who try it that actually succeed. Only then, once they passed it, will they maybe attempt to do some internships abroad if they specialize in international law, typically. And this is why the topic of clinics, for instance, is really starting to get to gain some steam in France, because that wasn't the case 10 years ago. Clinics are starting to pop up everywhere just to offer more and more students opportunities to gain some experience, which they would not have because they would need to get an internship in The Hague, for instance. So this is one of the reasons which pushed me to create my own clinic in Paris, to offer students an opportunity to gain some experience in ICL and in international humanitarian law as well, despite not setting a foot outside of this French bubble. I'm trying to get them to the experience of having an internship without actually putting them at risk or the university at risk. And I thought that was really interesting, especially considering what Aisha said earlier with the French methodology, which is really different from the rest. And maybe she could add to that, I don't know.
Right. So I have a more specific targeted question. So particularly for Yusra, and this will also be very useful for Mohit as he goes forward to the fellowship. So could you shed some light on your experience at the fellowship, because this is a very coveted position which students from all across the world sort of aim for, especially in the field of public international law. So could you share your experience at the ICJ?
I had a wonderful experience working in the judicial fellowship at the ICJ. It's something that I would just highly recommend for the simple fact that you're really at the heart of, you know, the heartbeat of like where international law really happens and where so much of it is kind of formed and made and thought about. I would say from an academic perspective as well, it's fascinating being at the Peace Palace just because their library and their resources are out of this world. And their staff as well in the library is super helpful. And one other thing I would say that's great about the Judicial Fellowship is that the scope, the breadth of international law topics that you're covering is so vast that even if you go in thinking, you know, I'm a specialized, you know, criminal lawyer, or I'm specialized in trade law or something, just being there and you know, being required to work on, you know, law of the sea issues or human rights issues or something that might be completely out of your breadth. It teaches you so much. It enables you to create connections between different areas of international law, which really enriches your own understanding of the subject matter, your own background, and you might even walk out of there having having developed different interests in maybe an area of international law or a specific subject that you know, wasn't apparent to you before. So I think in terms of having that open mind as a generalist in international law, it's extremely beneficial. I can't recommend it enough, but I am aware that it is the selection process is a little bit of a challenge, and that there is kind of a trend of certain typical universities that often will send their fellows there every year, and so there is a little bit of a problem with diversity. You find that a lot of the same universities will be represented year after year, and I did notice that when I was there, and I really hope that that will change in the right direction, especially considering that the General Assembly had just very recently started a fund to be able to provide the financing for particularly African universities that can send more students there for the fellowship. And I really hope that that will have kind of a different turn on the type of people that you see participating in the fellowship, because I really believe that people coming from different legal backgrounds, different, you know, cultural and educational backgrounds, really also enriches the work of the court, the perspectives, the discussions that are had within the Peace Palace. So I think that's very important.
Mohit, I hope you were taking notes as Yusra was saying all of this. So you have this very unique experience at the UN headquarters. So could you shed some light on your experience with the International Law Commission, but also to the fact that since you secured an internship initially, how difficult is it to secure a paid job at the UN headquarters in New York?
So I will just take you through my journey very briefly. I began in 2015 in India because I did not have a master's back then. And as I mentioned earlier, I cannot emphasize enough that a master's really is a key also for logistical reasons such as visa to other avenues. Now, a lot was spoken about the centers in Europe, but ultimately New York also, to the exception of everything else, happens to be a center. And I had that at the back of my mind when I was applying for a master's in the US. And so it was a conscious decision to be able to apply to the UN after my stint at Stanford. So the initial several hundreds of applications, if I may say so, were unsuccessful. So what I did thereafter was to be applying to the permanent mission of India to the UN. And I would like to make this observation for all of us here, that if we are interested in positions at international organizations, agencies affiliated to our foreign ministries are actually a great stepping stone and are in fact some kind of experiences which engage on us more in the deliberations. So I had the fortune of seeing the UN headquarters from both the sides of the coin, if I may put it that way. While I was at the mission, I was actually able to engage in deliberations upon resolutions which are passed at the UN General Assembly and the Security Council. And once my unpaid internship at the mission was over, was only when I was able to find, in fact, crawl my way into the UN Secretariat and find an internship at the UN Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. And there is where I think the visa-related logistics were less of a concern, because the UN has a G4 visa that can sponsor you and you can be working for them. And that's how I got my paid consultancy there. It was short-lived, and currently my position at the International Law Commission also happens to be unpaid, but there are absolutely no regrets, because I would like to say here that the ILC, in my opinion, is extremely similar in terms of the work that the ICJ does, because it is essentially looking at topics of international law for their progressive development, or topics which are a gray area, which are also traditionally topics which are taken to the ICJ because gray areas are disputes. So it's been a topsy-turvy ride from being paid to being unpaid to being paid and unpaid again now, but I'll be paid again at the ICJ. So yeah. I think there's a lot of patience required upon this path, which we all are treading upon. And I think it's very imperative to zone ourselves out, to have that Zen state of mind and not look at what our peers are doing in other fields of law, which is usually a steady graph, a steady growth. Thanks.
Right. I think it's great that you beautifully summed that up, the experience of an international lawyer. And there's the sense that there's also a certain amount of perhaps a privilege that not everybody has to be able to sustain themselves while they're pursuing an unpaid internship. And these are one of the most common criticisms as well. Along with unpaid internships, as Adetola mentioned earlier, that there seems to be this perception that the community of international law is very small, either centered in those European cities or even in the US. And if you're an Australian positivist, then probably you don't consider international law as law. I'm sure you would have heard that from your families and your relatives, that whatever you're doing is meaningless. But I would like to hear a bit more about this from Raghavi and Taylor, that also talk about how unpaid internships have been helpful to you, and are they as meaningful as they're put out to be? And along with that, there's something that everybody else should contribute as well, that Adetola talked about the importance of networks and participating in Moot court competitions and other competitions. I would like to hear your take on that as well. But first, let's hear it from Taylor and Raghavi.
Okay, great. So I realized that I moved to the Netherlands to do a master's program, and I had the opportunity to stay on and do an internship for which I received a small stipend. And I realized that I am so lucky to be able to do that. It's not really accessible to everyone, and I think it's a huge problem with unpaid internships, and there's a serious lack of diversity because of that, and that's really awful. So for me, doing my internship has been really beneficial in terms of building a network, gaining experience and more knowledge, and really finding where my interests lie. But I really want to encourage everyone who doesn't necessarily have the opportunity to travel abroad to study or to do an internship. There are still ways to break in. I mean, international law happens all over the world. There are universities where you can study international law all over the world. And increasingly, we live in this hyper-connected online environment. I mean, even more so now with the global pandemic. And I think there are a lot of ways to engage with international law and practitioners of international law and academics online. So I really don't want to discourage anyone who only has the opportunity to study in their home jurisdiction. Do that, but engage with people in LinkedIn. International law world on Twitter is nuts. It's people connecting all over the world, retweeting each other, tweeting at each other, and write blog posts. There are really ways to do it. And it's funny, some of the advice that I have repeatedly heard since being here in the Netherlands is, you know, it's really beneficial for you to get some legal experience in your domestic jurisdiction and to really get that practicing experience. And then it's so much easier to break into international law later on. So although I think, yes, certainly my internship has been really beneficial in terms of the substantive work that I've been able to do and the networks that I can build, I really do think it's possible to kind of break into this world, even if you don't have that opportunity.
Yeah, picking up from what Taylor said and going, I think this touches upon points that everybody has made. In my personal experience, I do think that there is no doubt that there is a lack of diversity in the field. But at the same time, I also feel like a larger part of the responsibility lies on the global south to make inroads. So oftentimes we consider ourselves removed because of how removed we've been, and we don't really push ourselves to the point where we can. Like, for instance, I think it is important, like Tola also mentioned, ultimately it's a question of visibility. So professors everywhere are looking for help. No matter what year you are, wherever you are in law school, tell them you want to help and they'll take your help. And as soon as you make yourself noticeable to one person, that creates a chain where you land yourself up in more useful opportunities. If not useful, at least more opportunities, which is all that matters. And I also think that when you come from the global south, the responsibility is heightened because in my experience, I think what we lack the most is really a peer network of people who have done similar things for you to take advice from, for you to be able to take counsel from. And I think that when you have the privilege, say because of your university or say because of your luck even, to make some inroads, it is absolutely essential that you pass the baton on, that you give all information necessary for people to access these resources back in your home country. And only then will you really create the concentric circles that international law currently needs, which it doesn't have. And secondly, on the point of the internships, I think that it is, again, very, very essential that you look at the sort of work that the internship promises at the start. Oftentimes, UN internships are clubbed as a group, and I don't think that is what is a relevant consideration. I think the sub area that the organization works in, the unit that you're applying to, the sort of work that the unit already says it's doing, all of these are more relevant considerations than just the name of the institution. Luckily for me, and in fact, I must confess that when I applied to the IRMCT, I was not aware of a core unit existing. I actually applied to the appeals unit. And when I got to the court, I realized that I had been assigned to the core unit. So for me, my internship at the IRMCT was like a sort of introduction to the unit itself. And I'm very thankful in hindsight that I worked there because of how integral it is to the IRMCT's current work, in that all the bulk of the contempt cases are handled by the core unit, all the national assistance, all the transfer of knowledge that they're doing with national jurisdictions now is also handled by the core unit. So I do think that my internship gave me a lot of exposure into how the law really translates in terms of impact, and what are the skills that the theory doesn't teach you, which was quite new for me, and I'm quite glad that I had it, because now I'm able to factor that in when I do when I conceive ideas for my PhD, because I know that there is no point of theorizing in the air. I know that it has to be grounded in real practice, in real policy. So in that sense, I think it was really helpful.
Right. Before I come to Aisha and Tola, I see your hands. I believe that Yusra has to leave. So if we can have a final word from her.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, there's so many different points that people brought up that were so interesting and that I'd like to build upon. I definitely can't stress enough the importance of being proactive if international law is something that you would like to do, in the sense that, building a little bit upon what Tola said when he mentioned that, you know, depending on what you want to do, what area you want to specialize in, that's the program that you will you'll choose the university program accordingly. And I also think that it's okay to not really know what you want to do. As Taylor mentioned, it's not something that she was very sure of. But even if that's the case, I can't stress enough the importance of just like asking, trying to get as much experience as you can, first of all. And if that's not a possibility, which, you know, I doubt, I think people tend to perhaps not want to dig enough. And Taylor mentioned a lot of great ways in which opportunities can be created by yourself. But if you're not able to kind of get the opportunities and experience that you would need to really like inform your decision of what it is that you want to do, then ask people. I actually think that in my experience, people are more often than not very happy to provide information, to act as mentors, to give you advice, and asking people even simple questions such as, you know, what their job entails or what it's like, whether you meet them at conferences or whether you email them. I think you'd be surprised about the amount of positive feedback that you could receive, and that could help you have a better idea of, you know, if international law is something for you, and what particular areas might interest you. So there definitely is a proactivity that's required to make it in the field. But it's so worth it. And as Raghavi said, we need as much diversity and inclusion as possible. And I think that we need to carve those opportunities out ourselves a lot of the time. And that's why I think that this discussion is so important to have. So I'm really thankful to have been a part of it. I wish it could go on for another few hours, because I think there's so much that we have to say. But I do thank you for this little setup that you made, and for allowing us to exchange. And I hope that that will be the beginning of a wider discussion.
Thank you, Yusra. Thank you. It was an absolute pleasure to have you, and I'm sure we'll have you back at some point in time again.
Thanks, I hope so.
So yeah, Tola and then Aisha.
Yes. I would like to just underline how internships are beneficial for theoretical knowledge. So I had two important internships in my life. One was at the Council of Europe, and the other was at the Transparency International. Council was very useful, beneficial for developing my knowledge in European Court of Human Rights jurisprudence, and working on corruption in Transparency International at international level inspired me for a better theoretical knowledge in my PhD proposal. That's all.
Sorry. So I just wanted to flag a number of things. I think first is, and I think it's because no one has flagged it, the place of writing and putting out your written articles. I think it's a very important place for young professionals. I had some of my big breaks in that way. So I remember that I wrote an article in a book in honor of Judge Koroma of the ICJ with a mentor figure of mine. So, and that actually gave me a lot of visibility early in my career. So so I think definitely that's a very important part. Writing, speaking at conferences, attending conferences, the place of mentorships, and I think Yusra said that the place of building relationship with mentors and sponsors and those who can help and just build, and I think I should flag this also for young professionals like myself and everyone on this call, that and those who are going to listen, that for mentors particularly, the focus should not be how to get things out of them. I think the focus should be how can I provide value to them, how can I support them on the work that they do. That way you build a more organic relationship, and that way they're able to help you along more in your career than if you're just trying to get things out of them every time. I think I should also wanted to say that a number of internships pay. So not all internships are unpaid. I know the internship I did at the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, it's not a lot of money, but they pay enough for you to I think they pay about, is it 5? I
think it's 450 euros.
Yeah, 450 euros. Yeah. So a number of internships pay. So I think people need to also check that out. They know internship pay. Another thing I was going to say also is that when we think of international law, a lot of us think of international organizations, but international law also happens in our countries, in academias, in the foreign services of our countries. And I think people should also pay some mind to looking at those kind of experiences. So a number of times, there are institutes in your countries that do a lot of research in international law. The foreign service in your country does a lot of work in international law that you also want to focus on. And so people just every time just think only international organizations, but there's a concentric circle of what exists that is not just in international organizations. The one thing I wanted to say also is that, and I think Raghavi said this already, about providing support to those that are behind you, that are also coming up. Because what happens is that you then start to ensure that you're also building a movement in your country and in your space in international law. And the thing I was also going to say is that for young professionals, I think there's an importance for finding community. What happens a number of times is that people try to go it alone. But I find that, listen, there's a place for finding community, building relationship with those who are at the same career level as you are. And for instance, I'm hoping that after this call, a lot of us will be able to keep in touch and just building community for those who are at the same level as you are, and just being able to support people and push opportunities to each other's way. I have friends who are always quick to send opportunities and information. The last thing I would say is that my experience is this. My experience is that the biggest and easiest way to build relevance for yourself in the international law community is to focus on the ways that international law actually affect real lives. So, for instance, in Nigeria, one of the most prominent international lawyers that we have is someone who's done this whole work around helping to push for use of international organizations, to push for human rights for people. So that concentric circle of what is the relevance of international law in real people's lives, in the lives of citizens. So for instance, for someone like myself who does international economic law, a big part is the AFCFTA. What does that mean for businesses? What does that mean for trade? What does that mean? And I think that's an important part also, because we can get so caught up in that international law bubble that we don't actually start to actually apply and how we apply it. And the last thing I would say is, people should be careful not to get caught up in the internship box where you're pushing one internship after another internship after another internship. You should be careful to say, I've done enough. Now I'm going to go get some experience or some paid work at some point.
I'm glad that you bring that up. That specifically that writing and research is ideally something which is not restricted by your geography. So how has your experience been in terms of writing to law journals or reviews, and how has that reception been? Maybe Alexander?
Well, I feel like I'm going to repeat myself, but that just goes on to confirm what I said about the French bubble, and that it's not a thing for French students. French law students typically learn in their first years that their opinions are not worth writing anything about, essentially. That's sad, but that's the way it is. One of the most common ways in which we are tested during our bachelor's is just commenting on judicial decisions. And this is one of the first times the professors encourage us to actually have some critical thinking about what we're reading. But still, typically the field of writing, legal writing, that's something that's reserved for either last year students, so like during your second year of master's, or PhD students, or professors. In France, that's how it works. Recently, I've begun seeing some blogs which have tried to offer something like this. I think there's I tried writing for one, but I had so many classes to take that I could not finish the article I was writing about. But it's slowly developing in that field, at least in France.
A lot of concerns and challenges have been raised, but I like how there are certain innovative approaches, such as Alexander started an international law clinic at his university. Aisha started an organization called Jus Cogens, and Mohit was talking about how even if you belong to a global southern country and there's a dearth of international organizations apparently which are working in your country, you can always approach. For example, he approached permanent mission to the United Nations. So there are such approaches as well. I would like to talk more specifically about the challenges that people from the Global South face while they're trying to enter a career in international law, and what sort of solutions or what sort of ideas do you think can be conceived to address these assumptions? Raghavi, maybe you'd like to add something to that?
Sure. Quickly on the point of writing, I completely agree that writing is extremely crucial in terms of your own understanding and in terms of recognition. But what I have noticed is that there seem to be lots of differences in curriculum and methodology, which is why oftentimes if you're, say, from India, or if you're from countries where there is not that much of a strong foundation of legal methodology, pieces that you write on international law don't get published in international journals. And so there seems to be and you end up publishing in national journals which are not as recognized. So there's really a big gap that you find hard to overcome. So for this, I think when you do moots or through self-learning, of course, institutional reform would be best, would be ideal. But if that's not possible, then I think student-led movements or student-led initiatives which create more discourse on correct legal methodologies, especially in international law, will be extremely helpful for you to get your publication, your writings published in international journals. And I think when you do this, when you get an opportunity where you are able to publish, it is extremely crucial that you cite scholars from the Global South, which is very rare. And because we don't do that, we ultimately keep fostering the bubble that we joined. So that's one. And I think that also sort of answers your question on what we can do as members from the Global South. And second, I also think that when you get to universities or when you get to places outside of your country, it makes it easier for you to spearhead initiatives that involve your own university. Say in terms of research profiles, or in terms of involving researchers. Now that most of the work happens on the internet, I don't think there are really any barriers when you know somebody has the caliber to do research. It is absolutely feasible for you to get their help regardless of where they are. And when you do that, that chain continues. So I think that's second. And third, I have seen this already. There are lots of law schools in India which absolutely support people who study outside and get them to teach. And I think it would be nice if we also express our interest to take up visiting faculty positions or honorary faculty positions in some of the universities in our countries. So we are able to establish some more parity in terms of methodology, in terms of curriculum, and just transfer of knowledge. So those might be more
but there's also the idea that unless you have a qualification, an LLM or a PhD from certain Western universities, you're less likely to receive acceptances in certain journals and reviews. So how has your experience been regarding that? Mohit, perhaps you can take that one.
So, Omer, I'm going to try and give two approaches which are probably not congruent, but those are food for thoughts for students who have especially not completed their law studies right now. So I feel that on the one hand, students should see the chronology that they are in and not try to be impatient to try and get in published at the most prestigious journals. So when you are a student, you can do many other things, such as take part in Moot court competitions, such as take part in MUNs or set up societies. But these are not things that you can do once you graduate. So that's why I stress on the chronology. You can write even after you graduate, but not the other way around. Now, what taking part in Moot court competitions does, and I'm going to give my own example here. During my law school, I had the great opportunity to take part in Moot court competitions such as the Philip C. Jessup, William C. Wiss Vienna, Manfred Lachs, Stetson. And I kid you not that the researches which I did in each of these Moot courts are actually till date my best published research papers, because I was able to convert the research of these comprehensive studies that I did by the very nature of moot court competitions, which in fact sack a lot of blood and sweat out of your life when you're participating in them, and most of us would agree with this. So I think it's a dual purpose that we can achieve through taking part in moot court competitions. Now, on the other hand, I feel that we should probably not be very picky and choosy, especially in the beginning of our careers, as to where we'd like to get published, because I think ultimately the content is the king. And if you are confident enough about what you've written, you might get it published at a place which was not your desired place, but that is actually what is going to help you make a mark. And that's how you're going to proceed to a better journal, and so on and so forth. Even my first few publications were not at the best places, but then having acquired that skill set of writing, which Raghavi mentioned, and the fact that my moot court researches, which I felt were, which I'd like to believe were decent enough for getting me those publications, is what I'm trying to allude at. And lastly, I would like to say that no matter which part of the world you're coming from, no matter what your legal training might be, but when you participate in moot court competitions, all that difference dissipates. That is when actually you are at a level playing field. And if you on a given day have worked hard, and of course luck is a factor there, then you can take anyone down, and that entire simulation will give you the much needed impetus to hone yourself to write better in the future as well.
No, I think I completely agree with what Mohit had said. In fact, since I presume not many of you have participated in moot court competitions. So back when I did my Jessup moot court, I had never studied public international law as a subject. And in fact, I still haven't studied public international law as a subject, but my progression has sort of been through these competitions, and this is how I got to learn international law, and this is over time how I have grown as well. So Aisha, if you could, if you have some thoughts on this particular point as well.
I have no chance to join any moot court. I had no experience. I was selected for Jessup National, but my university has canceled our participation. So unfortunately, but I should leave if you give me authorization. So
absolutely,
I'm so glad to meet you, really, and I'm very impressed.
Likewise.
Thank you very much for inviting me tonight.
Thank you for coming.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Very insightful. Bye. So I think this is where we start to round off the discussion. And if I could just have concluding thoughts from everyone, we'll start with Taylor. So concluding thoughts.
So I think today's discussion has been really interesting, and we've kind of heard from people from all different paths. And I think that kind of is the point. There is no one path in international law. There are so many different opportunities. I mean, you can be an international lawyer in a foreign ministry, at a university, in an NGO, in an academic institute, in a national court, in an international court, in a hybrid court. There is no set path. So I think that I really have to agree with the points that have been made today, and that you really have to put yourself out there, dig deep, and try and make the most of any and all opportunities you have. It can be just as simple as reaching out to someone and asking for some advice, for offering your help, and then things can really snowball from there. So I think I would just echo that everything that everyone said today, and really encourage people who are interested in international law to go out there and seek it out, because it's fascinating, and I think a lot of good can be done in the world from international lawyers.
Right. Alexander, if we could just come to you.
Well, it's going to be really hard to top what Taylor just said, but I'm going to try nevertheless. Yeah, there is no set path, and I think everyone has an opportunity to make a name for themselves in international law. If we just go out and seek those opportunities, then anyone can either seek those opportunities or make those opportunities yourself. I'm not gonna, I don't want to brag by saying this, but the clinic I created because I had no opportunities in Paris, and because I had an experience with clinics in Leiden, and I was frustrated that there was no such clinic for my project in Paris, so I created my own. And I encourage everyone that's listening to us to do this as well if they can. And if there's any French listeners here on this podcast, I also encourage them to go beyond this bubble I kept talking about today. But this is because this is a bubble and we need to burst it.
Right, thank you. So Tola, if we could have concluding thoughts from you.
Thank you. So I think I'll just start by saying one hack that I've found for young professionals like myself is to piggyback on the work that others have done. And so what I mean by that is, and I give an example in writing articles, and I think it's probably the simplest example, that if you know a prominent person, lecturer, who's already made some name in international law, you have access to them, they're lecturers or something, what you find out a number of times that they already get a lot of offers to write in articles in different magazines, but they can't take up all those opportunities because they're too busy, they don't have the time to do the research. One easy thing I found was to offer to do the research in lieu that would both publish the articles together. So it gave me a lot of big opportunities at the beginning of my career where I would say, listen, you have this opportunity from this person, I'll write the article with you, and then we could publish it together. So that's just one thing I was going to say for young professionals. The second thing I would say is there definitely is not one part. Everyone would find different parts, and everyone will find different levels of satisfaction in different parts. And we must be careful not to get railroaded thinking that one person's success story is the only way to pull it out. So if one person is working in an NGO or working in an international organization, making that quick conclusion that that's the only way to make success in international law. The third thing I would say is that if you're made some success already, open the doors for those that are coming behind you. I can't say that enough. Open the doors for those that are coming behind you. The fourth thing I would say is for persons like myself who come from developing countries, and I think even from those who come from developed countries, what you find a number of times that you would quickly develop some level of imposter syndrome when you find yourself in those big rooms, because you're thinking, do I have the same training that these people have? Do I have the same skill set that they have? Do I have the same methodology understanding that they have? Let me say this: everyone has the same blood and flesh and brain, and even those who you admired a lot, the most fantastic lecturers, have just the same insecurities that you might think you face. And so I've learned quickly that what young professionals need to do is to work hard so that when the opportunities come, they're ready for the opportunities that come their way. And the last thing I would say is that build communities, focus on communities, build things together. And yes, anything you plan to do in international law is doable if you set your mind to it.
Right. So Mohit, if we could have some thoughts from you.
Thank you. So I would like to begin with one aspect that I haven't touched yet, and I think which has been a very prevalent theme in today's discussion, which is the importance of networking within this niche circle of public international law or international investment attorneys or the like. I think the power of LinkedIn should not be underutilized. And I say that very specifically because that has helped me immensely in my career thus far. Reaching out to people can lead to any responses, but we need not be bothered about how the response is going to be. If there are like-minded people and enthusiastic people like you, then you are going to receive the response that you desire for. Now, besides this, I'm going to try and speak a sentence or two about the 4 or 5 topics that we've touched upon today. The first one, which is about a possible path to success in public international law, I think I couldn't agree more with everyone else. There is no set path. And in fact, I would encourage all the listeners today to not have a set path, because if you tread along several paths such as academia, litigation, and going into international organizations, it is only then that you develop a holistic understanding of public international law. And I have really endeavored to do that in my short career thus far. On the point of research papers and moot courts, as I mentioned earlier, it's just about accessing the right resources and knowing the right opportunities. Whether or not we get published at the best places should not be much of a consideration early on in your career. About centers of international law, I think that distinction is dissipating for the good, and we can begin from anywhere and everywhere. We have such encouraging examples with us today about not having opportunities and creating opportunities for ourselves. So I think that sitting in any part of the world, we can ultimately reach our goal. It might take a bit longer, but we should be rest assured that we will get there. On the point of a master's program, I think the foremost thing to keep in mind is to do a master's without any expectations of something that might lead to a fruition after a master's, because ultimately what we must also realize is that the entire experience of a master's or a PhD is a very beautiful one, which is inexplicable in words. Being with a community of multicultural people, learning their best practices, not just otherwise, but also legal best practices, is something that hones all of us as attorneys and better practitioners. So those are my comments, and thank you very much for having me today. Hope to have many, many more such discussions in the future.
Definitely. Very, very insightful. Thank you. So Raghavi, if we could end off today's discussion with your thoughts.
Yes. Firstly, thank you, everybody. I think this was a really insightful discussion and one that must be sustained now that there's been a first start. In conclusion, I think first, which I don't know if we spoke about enough, is that now that we know that this journey is going to be so long, that there's so much perseverance involved, I think one thing that's absolutely essential is for you to love it, for you to actually love the subject before you decide to completely immerse yourself in looking for opportunities. So I think take your time, don't rush into it, explore all subject areas in your domestic, in your preliminary degrees and your further degrees, and then be certain that you want to do this, and then completely immerse yourself in figuring out how you want to do it. Second, I think it is also important for us to be conscious not to box ourselves, even in terms of our career choices. Oftentimes, we don't realize how the career choices we make in our past have a deep influence in what we end up doing, or you take a stint and do some advocacy and then come and do academia. Even that deeply influences the sorts of academic contributions you make. So like we all agree, there is really no set path, but you must also be flexible in the paths you take and be willing to move around. So that I think that really makes for more fruitful contributions, more incisive contributions, if nothing else. And thirdly, like I said at the start, create conversation, sustain conversation, and take international law to your home countries, because that's really the one area where we haven't explored enough for us to go back to the start, which is where we came from. And I think once we do that, we will be able to color international law more, which is really what it means. So I'd like to thank all of you for this platform, and I really hope that the listeners also tune in and create a larger chain of participants in this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
I think I speak on behalf of everybody that this was a very enlightening and interesting discussion. And I hope the listeners would agree with us. And if you have nothing else to do, just start a podcast on international law. It reaches more places than you think it would. So on that positive note, that's all from us this time. And we'll see you in the next episode. Thank you so much.